Where's Rod Liddle? He was meant to. I think I may know where he is. And Toby Young was meant to be here today, but he's decided to go and watch QPR play at Blackpool. Yeah, and I've done that myself. I'm very fond of QPR, but he's missing out because this is the future of the country. Chair, conference, fellow Social Democrats, it's good to be together again. And it's with great pride that we assemble here today, because this year is the 40th anniversary of the foundation of the Social Democratic Party. And there's a direct line between Limehouse in 1981 and here, and that line, at times it's hung by a thread, but we survived, and we lived to fight another day. The SDP holds a special place in our politics, as it's the biggest challenge to the two-party system in British political history, and I'm very proud of that challenge, and I'm very proud of the history, but actually today's conference is about the future, not the past. Our green paper that we're launching today shortly is called The End of Indifference. And there are many vices from which a political class can suffer, corruption, arrogance, incompetence. But I think the particular pathology which affects us here in Britain is indifference. We need to talk about indifference. I'm talking about a general attitude, a stance that particular things here and there don't really matter. It's a type of complacency. It's that this isn't my problem or indeed our problem. We can just walk on the other side of the street. And I think this attitude is everywhere, and it must be confronted, because ultimately our future as a nation is determined by this. We've become indifferent to what is made, where and by whom, to growing inequality, to the need to train our own citizens. We're indifferent to massive household, government and corporate debt. We're indifferent to the loss of secure employment. We're indifferent to huge regional divides, to persistent trade deficits and the loss of our industry. And the problem is that this type of economic indifference, I think, has coincided with equivalent apathy on the social side. Those that govern us are indifferent to the steady disintegration of the family, to the need for affordable homes, to rising levels of ill health and drug dependence, and to the pernicious impact of screens and social media on the well-being of our children. And they're also indifferent to public realm, to our towns and cities becoming increasingly litter-strewn and neglected. I think we've got to get to the root of this. The blame, I think, lies at the door of a particular type of liberalism. Quote, "Liberalism is merely another name for indifference." Somerset Maugham said that in the late 1800s, and I think he's right, because you can see the hand of indifference everywhere. Let me give you a few examples. We're currently living through a crisis in power generation. This largely is the result of Tony Blair being more interested in dropping bombs in Iraq than securing domestic power capacity. He probably thought domestic power capacity was boring. But a failure to plan has consequences. You really don't want to be governed by people that have an aversion to planning. And Blair's soulmates, Cameron and Osborne, were no better, more interested in giving contracts to the French and the Chinese than in restoring Britain's nuclear industry. Both are examples of indifference. It was the same with 5G. And I think it takes a special type of indifference, otherwise known as insanity, to think it's sensible to put the Chinese Communist Party in charge of your communications network, but that's what they were going to do. That's what they intended to do. Digression. There won't be too many of these. Is it too much to actually put our country first? To put the country above foreign vested interests? I don't think so. And I don't think we're asking for much in looking at that. It's the same pattern with industry. The pandemic revealed the extent of our industrial suicide as we scrambled around the globe for essential supplies. And yet we're constantly told by free trade purists that the only thing that matters is price. Even if what you're buying was made with the use of slavery, they're not bothered. It's price every time. So our industry's been gutted, factories have been closed, and we've become addicted to cheap imports. But like the man who saws off the branch upon which he's sitting, they've forgotten that producers are also consumers. Destroying the industrial wage not only undermines the family and puts at risk our health and public services, it ultimately puts those services at risk because they're underpinned by what we produce. And no successful economy, no successful industrial economy does this. The Japanese don't do it, the South Koreans don't do it. Why? Because in South Korea, companies are basically patriotic. They realize it's of necessity. They realize that producing things is the foundation of Korean society. The people that govern us take a very different view. To them, everything is for sale, which is why the list of firms sold off to foreign buyers is so long. Let's have a look at a few examples. Cadbury's, Rowntree Macintosh, Jaguar Land Rover, ICI, British Steel, Pilkington, Chorus, Asda, you name it. Remember that free trade purism is a fair weather doctrine, and the weather is liable to change. When politicians say that Britain's open for business, what they really mean is that Britain's open for sale. It's up for sale. We see the same pattern of indifference to family life. The crisis in family formation and stability is barely mentioned in political discourse. The fact that a British 16-year-old is more likely to have a screen in their room than a father in their house is not addressed. Almost nothing is spoken about it and nothing is done about it. And yet study after study demonstrates the fact that the two-parent model provides the best outcomes for children and for society. You can have your own opinions on this, but you're not entitled to your own facts, and those are the facts. And I have to say, I find it bleak that you see young people, some young people, a minority probably, putting up videos on social media saying, I'm not going to have kids, the climate crisis is so bad, I'm just going to give up. That is so bleak. I reject it. Quote, "The men and women who revolt against the family are revolting against mankind." That's Chesterton. And actually, I usually quote Chesterton, but I wasn't going to quote Chesterton. I did so because he's been cancelled. So that made it a necessity. But he's right. Quite right. Have kids, build lives, and look to the future. But to do that, you need something else. You need somewhere to live. Which brings me to the biggest crisis, I think, in British politics, which is housing. And I'll ask a serious question. I don't want to be unkind, but what is more anti-family and anti-social? What is more anti-family and anti-social? All the woke, progressive ideology that we're talking about, or conservative housing policy? Seriously, I think it's the latter. Let's look at the facts. State capacity in house building has been basically destroyed. It's been taken off the table. And as a result, housing completions are at record lows. In this city, the average house price is about 14 times income. In other words, unaffordable. So you end up with generation rent, which is generation stuck. This is a disgrace. It's antisocial, and it represents a major breach, I think, of the social contract. And of course, I think the Tories know about this. There have been plenty of reports, going back decades actually, about the housing crisis, but nothing is done about it. And I think there are 11 million reasons why nothing is done about it. Because that's basically the donation they get from the house builders every year. And I think if you want to be governed by people that are in the pocket of vested interests, vote Conservative. And if that wasn't enough, high immigration adds to the pressure. So you end up with beds in sheds and 16 people sharing suburban houses. This is indifference on steroids. How any party can go into elections claiming or calling itself conservative while deliberately destroying the ability of its own people to have families, beggars believe. But the Tories have been conning voters on this for years, as they have on immigration. This year, thousands of young men, mainly young men, have arrived on the south coast unvetted, unchecked and uninvited. And I think the surest way to destroy the mutuality which created our welfare state is to allow this to continue. You can have open borders or you can have a welfare state. You can't have both. The Australians sorted this out years ago. They should ask my wife. This is not a problem of resources. It's a problem of political will, like so many other areas. There's a very important line in David Goodhart's seminal book, The Road to Somewhere, on this. David points out basically how progressives have gone wrong on this issue. On mass immigration, too enthusiastic, and on integration, too indifferent. I think he's right. So that's the bad bit. You need cheering up now, because when I was writing, this was the most difficult. This is my 5th speech as leader, and this is the most difficult one. To tackle indifference head on is a serious thing. But I don't want you to be gloomy. I think you need cheering up now. I don't want anyone going there saying they went to the SDP Conference and Clouston banged on about indifference for half an hour and I wanted to throw myself in the Thames. No. We are fortunate, actually, and this is part of the solution, because there's a very, very simple cure to the problem of indifference, and that is to start to care. And that is actually what the Social Democratic Party is here for. We need to care enough for the state to build some of the houses that people need. We're not asking for much. We need to care enough to start making things and reshoring industry. We need to ensure that more of what we buy is made here in Britain. And I think that's not only economically sensible, as you'll hear from the Green Paper, it's ecologically sensible. We need to revive Britain's civil nuclear industry, which is the only way to create reliable baseload to reduce CO2 emissions. The only way you can do it. And we need to care enough to have a secure border to protect us, our own citizens, and deter illegal migration, which saps confidence in the future of our social wage. We need to be strong enough to remove state funding from any university that permits the deliberate hounding from campus of an eminent philosopher, our friend, for doing her job. If a philosopher in the Western tradition, like Kathleen Stock, can't do work on categories and meaning, you can't do philosophy in the UK. But that's where we are after many years of a Conservative government. We've got to elect Social Democrats like Wayne Dixon, who I think is the Lee Kuan Yew of Middleton, who not only talks the walk but walks the walk. He organises litter picks, he runs charities and runs his local football club. And he's a credit to us, and we need more people like him. We need to take more action on animal welfare for 2 reasons. Because it's right and it pleases Rod Liddle. But we need to also concentrate on what we can do post-Brexit to restore our forest ecosystems and replenish our marine environments, and that might mean that the odd French trawler might have to be removed. Well, we've got to care enough to defend and support traditional family life, the bedrock of society, wherever we can, in tax, and in particular in cultural discourse. I wrote a piece, please get a copy, get them while you can. Bournebrook magazine kindly let me write a piece for them this time on this. But I argue that basically defending the family has become almost forbidden. And it can't be. It's ridiculous. Read the piece. I think it's. Thanks for allowing me to write it. We've got to care enough to care who runs our railways. At present, other states are running them, and I think that's wrong. We should run them, and we should build our own locomotives and our own rolling stock. And I think an interesting idea would be to seek a royal charter for the railways and create Royal British Railways. An emblem of British organisation, engineering and pride. And all of these things that I'm talking about can be done. But you've got to elect people that want to do them. The will to do it is the key. Never let anyone say that politics and public policy doesn't matter. It does. And if you don't believe me, just look around the world. Look at any state that's made it, like a state like Singapore, which has made basically everything out of nothing. And then look at what some other people have to live with, where leaders are corrupt, incompetent and inept. And then say it doesn't matter. Ask anyone facing public disorder or looting or rioting or war or food shortages. Of course it matters. What we're doing matters. I must now turn to some of the political events which have occurred since we were last together 2 years ago, and there have been many. First, Brexit. Actually, when we met in Leeds, we didn't really know what was going to happen on this. But the blockage of 2019 was resolved, I think, in the best way it could be, in the ballot box. And it was brutal, but necessary. We had very little time to prepare for that election, but we fielded 20 candidates, largely thanks to the efforts of our then national organiser, Lisa Renfrey, who really pulled it together. And it was a very polarising election, but the SDP anyway, we increased our vote on 2017 by 700%. And the election was actually cathartic, wasn't it? I don't know what you thought. It didn't occur to Labour and the Lib Dems that ignoring the 2016 vote was a lethal strategy. And if you demonise most, certainly 52% of the electorate, as xenophobic, illiterate, stupid, racist, then they might just return the favour. Of course, the election resolved that Brexit would happen, but it didn't actually resolve what type of Brexit it would be. And as I've said many times, actually, it makes very little sense to rid yourself of technocratic control from Brussels, only to hand that control to other bureaucrats and things like the WTO. So the Lexit vision, the left-wing vision of Brexit, which were preferred by ourselves and 5 million citizens, was really all about strong self-government and a government capable of making its own social and economic bargains. Basically, if a nation-state can't keep a steel plant open, it's not the nation-state that we seek. And I think going forward, actually, we need to be very careful, because we have the walking trade deficit known as the Foreign Secretary going around the world making trade deals. And if you look at the Japan trade deal, for instance, not a good trade deal for us on the detail if you model it. Our exports, we might sell them some whiskey and biscuits, but their exports would go up by 80% to us. So you've got to be careful with that. My views on the pandemic are well known. I've written and talked about it quite a lot. And I've tried to guide the party responsibly. And Frank Furedi mentioned evidence-based policy and rational decision-making. Well, actually, funnily enough, those are exactly the ideas I've tried to hold to in guiding the party through the pandemic. We've come to slightly different conclusions than other people have, but that's basically what I tried to do. I called the original lockdown a tragic necessity, and we supported the government, but increasingly as the goalposts kept on being moved, I found it very difficult to support them. Why? Because the major scandal of the pandemic has been, I think, the refusal of the government to properly assess or even attempt to quantify the social and economic costs of the suppression measures themselves. That's what they've missed. And it's been as if the trade-offs don't really exist, as if spending $450 billion has no opportunity cost, or not treating cancer patients has no cost, or not teaching kids does no harm. Now, the government had two expert committees advising them on how to flatten viral curves, and very narrow advice it was. But they had no expert committee advising them on the wider cost of the suppression measures. And I think this actually is one of the biggest failures of public policy in my lifetime. I think it was very difficult to get this right, and actually it was very difficult for any government to get it right. But I think the SDP's cautious, lockdown skeptic view, pro-vaccine but anti-mandate position was right. But the interesting thing was that there was no political opposition to any of this, and it's been a scandal. The interests of children were defended by Us for Them. Cancer patients were represented by Carol Sakura. Rationality in public science was argued for by Senator Gupta and Carl Hennigan. And journalistic scrutiny was provided by Peter Hitchens, Alison Pearson, Toby Young, Freddie Sayers, Majid Nawaz, and Mike Graham. Why? Why was this? Because Labour did what it was paid for. It backed the public sector unions. Yeah, I'll try it. Yeah, it backed the public sector unions who, as Van Morrison commented, hadn't missed a paycheck throughout. And you won't find a better instance of vested interest politics than that, which is exactly what this party was set up to be against. Interlinked with the pandemic was the wave of events which followed the appalling murder of George Floyd in Minneapolis. I think Black Lives Matter and the moral panic that followed was politically fascinating. As Ben Cobley noted, the BLM slogan was a masterpiece of political rhetoric because you couldn't criticize it without appearing to oppose the idea that black lives indeed matter. Very clever, very good. I think this partly explained the speed at which BLM's narrative rolled over all of our institutions, our government, our media, the academy, sport, big business, the lot, despite and explicitly being anti-Western, anti-capitalist, anti-police, and anti-family. That didn't matter. And it was very interesting that it didn't matter. The fascinating thing was that BLM couldn't be assessed in the same way that a normal political movement could. In fact, we did assess it in that way, but no one else did. Very few people did. Normal judgments could not be made. Facts were set aside, including the central claim of a racial disparity in police shootings in the United States. That was false. Fryer's team at Harvard proved that it was false, had shown this, but no one was interested because it was against the narrative. And I think it's quite astonishing that mainstream media, like the BBC, literally stopped functioning. And as a result, people were misled, seriously misled. An example, surveys revealed that nearly half of very liberal Americans, you know, the type of Americans that are clever and went to universities, the well-informed ones, actually believe that the number of unarmed black men killed annually by the police in the States is between 1,000 and 10,000. That's what half of them believe. The 2019 figure was 13, and that's 13 too many, but this is wildly different in perception to reality. I think what went on was journalistic malpractice on a gigantic scale. And it's highly irresponsible. It raises the racial temperature and increases tension between groups and makes it harder for fellow citizens to live in peace. The hottest places in hell are reserved for those who, in a period of moral crisis, maintain their neutrality. Dante. True. The solution is Don't Divide Us, which is the campaign organised by Claire Fox and others, which I was proud to support. You will not bring people together by emphasising their differences. We've got to bring people together. And remember that we're a tolerant country, and that a precondition for any society that's diverse is civilised toleration of differences. That's what it's about. The withdrawal of American forces from Afghanistan 2 months ago thankfully brought an end to a disastrous period of Western intervention in the Middle East and beyond. The post-9/11 invasions planned by Bush, Blair and the other neocons were, I think, an act of willful folly. What started as crude revenge ended up destabilising the states involved, causing untold misery and deaths in aggregate of over 1 million people, including 635 in the British military. I agree with Majid Nawaz. To think that invasion would reduce Islamist radicalisation is, I think, ludicrous. Invasion of a sovereign territory is a serious violation of that territory. No less ludicrous was the mission creep of trying to justify invasion in terms of building liberal democracies, modern liberal democracies. In Iraq, the state's apparatus collapsed after the invasion and ethnic conflict and chaos ensued. As John Gray commented at the time, to think that democracy can be established under such conditions is not just far-fetched, it's imbecilic. The people of Afghanistan and Iraq and our own servicemen and women deserved better, and they didn't get it. Let's hope that chapter is finished. The final part of my speech is about our political opponents. This is one of the things that you've always got to put into a political speech like this. But it's actually a part that I enjoy, partly because it allows me to contrast our political opponents with the SDP at its most subversive. Why? Because vested interests are the fundamental basis of our political system. Vested interests in both parties. Labour for the public sector and the Tories for entrenched privilege. To say that we have a non-interest-based politics would be false. I think the big question is, could we? Could we have it? We believe that we could. We believe that we could govern for the whole country and not just parts. And we shouldn't flinch from it. This is a very, very subversive idea, and it's very SDP. Most of my earlier comments about indifference were actually directed to the Tories, and I won't add much more on that, but I'll offer you a Roger Scruton quote, which I think illustrates their problem. Scruton defined conservatism as the instinct, at least if we're happy in the world, to hold on to what we love. I think he was right. It's a beautiful sentiment. The problem is that the Conservative Party doesn't agree with him. It's conserved virtually nothing and has never been able to tell the difference between what something is worth and what it costs. And the sad thing is that there are Conservative voters, but they haven't had a party to vote for. It was Abraham Lincoln who said, "There are very few things wholly evil or wholly bad. Almost everything is a compound of the two." But of course he hadn't come across the Liberal Democrats. Only joking, But it's an odd party, the Lib Dems. They try to combine social democracy, classical liberalism, and high-progressive sort of wokery in one tent. And of course, it's not a very good tent anyway. I mean, that's the point. And the result is incoherence. The voters can't tell if these people are Arthur or Martha. And the irony is that their leaders can't tell Arthur from Martha either. You'll never make a nation fit for the struggles of life if you yourself struggle with reality. Who said that? I did just then, about the Liberal Democrats. And always remember, in elections and any other interaction with the Lib Dems, remember that this party is the older party and it's the better party. Turning to Labour, first a confession, I did read Keir Starmer's 12,000-word missive. I mean, I had to. And I settled myself down, got a cup of tea, got myself comfortable, and started reading. But my eyes just sort of kept on going off the screen onto junk mail and pieces of utility bills or whatever. But anyway, I got through it. Sorry, Keir, but anyway. But I have to commend Labour on the effectiveness of its recent political strategy. You really have to hand it to them. They've alienated and demonised their former patriotic working class voters. They've dishonoured the biggest democratic vote in British history. They've argued for open borders, which reduce wages and disincentivise training. They've called their opponents scum. They've run down the country at every opportunity, and they're up to their necks in divisive ID politics. And I have to say, as a strategy to lose votes and alienate people, this could hardly be improved upon. It's worked. Labour are in real trouble. They're toast. Perhaps the best illustration of the trouble they're in is the recent interview between Nick Ferrari and Rachel Reeves. I think probably a few of you saw it. In the interview, Ferrari asked, "Is it transphobic to say that only women have a cervix, yes or no?" Rachel answered, look, is it transphobic? Look, burr. I don't even know how to answer these questions. And I don't want to be mean to Rachel Reeves, who seems a nice person, but she's an experienced politician. And a simple question reduced her to jabbering nonsense. And this is because of the absurdity of the ideology that they've lapped up. That's the problem. When they reject scientific facts and you forget what we knew yesterday, you get into real trouble. I prefer Rod Liddell, who said, with the reasoning that the great empiricist philosopher David Hume would be proud, although he's been cancelled now, I know there are women. I've seen them. Labour has forgotten what the late, great Peter Shaw knew, that any party of the left must be unifying rather than divisive in nature. You bring people together, you don't drive them apart. I think, in truth, if you're looking for the political heirs of Attlee and Gaitskell and Callaghan and Shaw, you won't find them in the Labour Party. You'll find them in this room. Before I finish, I have some thank yous to make. I'd like to thank all my colleagues on the National Committee and on the regional committees, all SDP candidates in all elections recently, and I'd like to thank the 52,307 members of the public who voted for us this year. I'd like to thank Michael Taylor for his inspirational contribution to the End of Indifference Green Paper, and to Matthew Kirtley for bootstrapping it. I'd like to thank Rod Liddle and Patrick O'Flynn for not just believing in the SDP, but for believing in me. Thank you. And I'd also like to thank all our guests and the wonderful speakers today. And guests, if you're not a member of the party, but you feel at home, perhaps you'll join us. Thanks for everyone for turning up. So to finish, basic question, how far can we go? I think we can go all the way, but it will take time. The three-line history of the SDP. The Gang of Four created it, David Owen ensured its independence, and the grassroots kept it alive. But we're writing a fourth line now, that together we revived it. The SDP was created to free the British people from rotten political parties and a rotten system. And I think that's as true today as it was 40 years ago. We lived to fight another day, and fight we will. Thank you.